The date was March 18, 2026. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room was packed to capacity with reporters, photographers, and a gallery filled with veterans advocates who had traveled from 12 different states. At the witness table sat Senator Lindsey of South Carolina, flanked by two aides who kept passing him briefing papers he barely glanced at. He was relaxed, almost bored, the way a man gets when he's testified before Congress so many times that the rituals have lost all meaning. He adjusted his microphone with the casual authority of someone who had spent 3 decades in these rooms and expected to spend 3 more. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas was arranging a series of folders on the table in front of her, each one labeled with a small color-coded tab. She was new to Congress by his standards, a first-term representative from a Dallas district, a former civil rights attorney who had never served in the military and whose legal background Graham had publicly dismissed as irrelevant to defense policy just 48 hours earlier on Fox News. He had called her a social media personality playing dress-up in serious rooms. He had said she was out of her depth and that the hearing would prove it. He had smiled when he said it, the way men smile when they believe they've already won. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he settled into his chair that morning, was that Jasmine Crockett had spent 6 weeks preparing for this exact moment. She had requested every Pentagon Inspector General report from the past 4 years. She had interviewed 47 military families personally. She had reviewed Graham's own voting record on 17 separate defense appropriations bills and cross-referenced every public statement he'd made about military readiness against the actual funding outcomes, and she had brought all of it with her in those folders. Graham glanced at the stack and then at her, and something in his expression shifted for just a fraction of a second before settling back into comfortable contempt. He leaned toward his microphone and said, in a voice loud enough to carry to the press gallery, that he hoped the gentle lady from Texas had brought her civics textbook because she was going to need a refresher on how appropriations actually work in the real world. The room quieted. Crockett didn't look up. She was writing something on a legal pad with the kind of focus that suggested she hadn't heard him at all, or had heard him perfectly and decided his words weren't worth acknowledging yet. Graham continued. He thanked the committee chair for the opportunity to address what he called a series of baseless allegations being circulated by freshman members who didn't understand the complexities of defense procurement. He said the military budget was not a checkbook that could be balanced by people who had never served, never commanded, never made the kinds of life and death decisions that required actual battlefield experience rather than courtroom rhetoric. He was hitting his stride now, voice rising with the practiced cadence of a man who had given this speech in various forms for 20 years. He talked about his service in the Air Force Reserve, his visits to combat zones, his personal relationships with 4-star generals who trusted his judgment on readiness issues. He said that armchair critics with law degrees and Twitter followers didn't get to lecture him about what the military needed, because he had been there. He had seen it. He had earned the right to speak on these matters through service that some people in this room couldn't begin to comprehend. The aides were nodding. The press gallery was taking notes. Graham sat back in his chair with the satisfied posture of a man who had just delivered the opening argument in a case he believed was already decided. He looked directly at Crockett for the first time since his testimony began and said he was happy to answer any questions she might have, as long as they were relevant to actual defense policy and not social media talking points. Crockett placed her pen down with the gentleness of someone placing a scalpel on an operating table. She looked up. Her face was completely calm. "Thank you, Senator Graham." She said it quietly, almost warmly, as though they were colleagues discussing a minor procedural matter rather than adversaries in a nationally televised hearing. She appreciated his willingness to answer questions, and she promised him she would keep her questions very simple and very specific. She opened the first folder, the one with the blue tab, and removed a single sheet of paper. It was a printout of a Pentagon Inspector General report dated November 2024, and she read the title aloud slowly enough that the stenographer wouldn't miss a word. Report on delays in Veterans Prosthetic Equipment Procurement due to budget reallocation, fiscal year 2024. She looked up at Graham and asked him if he was familiar with this report. He said he was familiar with dozens of IG reports and couldn't be expected to remember everyone. She nodded as though this was a perfectly reasonable answer and said she would refresh his memory. In November 2024, the Pentagon Inspector General found that 412 veterans who had been fitted for prosthetic limbs experienced delays ranging from 6 to 14 months because funds allocated for the Veterans Prosthetic Equipment account had been reallocated mid-year to a different program. She paused and asked Graham if he recalled voting for the supplemental appropriations bill that authorized that reallocation. He shifted slightly in his seat and said that supplemental bills were complex packages and that he voted for overall military readiness, not against veterans. Crockett opened the second folder, the one with the green tab. She removed a stack of papers and placed them on the table in front of her with the care of someone handling evidence in a criminal trial. "These are the voting records, Senator." She turned to a marked page and read aloud, "Senate Bill 2847, Supplemental Defense Appropriations Act of 2024, Section 12, Subsection C, Line Item 47. Reallocation of Veterans Prosthetic Equipment Account Funds to Advanced Weapons Systems Development. Your vote?" "Aye." She looked up at him and asked if that refreshed his memory. Graham's face had taken on a slightly darker color, and he said that weapons systems development was essential to national security and that difficult budget decisions had to be made in a finite fiscal environment. Crockett said she understood that completely and appreciated his honesty. Then she asked him what weapons system had been so urgent that it justified delaying prosthetics for 412 veterans who had already lost limbs serving the country he claimed to prioritize. The silence that followed was not complete. Somewhere in the press gallery, a camera shutter clicked 3 times in rapid succession. Someone coughed, but Graham said nothing. His jaw tightened and his hands, which had been resting casually on the table, now gripped the edge with enough force that his knuckles showed white against his skin. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Crockett waited with the patience of a prosecutor who knows the witness has no good answer and that the silence itself is the answer. Finally, Graham said that the reallocation had gone to the F-35 modernization program, which he considered a critical national security priority. Crockett nodded slowly and opened the third folder, the one with the red tab. She removed a second IG report and held it up so the cameras could see the Department of Defense seal on the letterhead. Pentagon Inspector General Assessment of F-35 Modernization Program Expenditures, Fiscal Year 2024. She didn't read from it immediately. Instead, she asked Graham if he had read this report when it was released in January 2025. He said he had been briefed on it. She asked if his staff had provided him with page 18, which contained what the IG called critical findings on cost overruns and timeline failures. Graham said he didn't have the report memorized. Crockett said that was fine because she had brought it for him. She read aloud, "Of the $470 million reallocated to the F-35 modernization program in FY 2024, $218 million were spent on contractor fees for work later deemed redundant by Pentagon engineers. An additional $93 million were allocated to a software upgrade that was abandoned mid-development due to incompatibility issues identified after funding had been committed." She looked up. "That's $311 million, Senator, gone. No aircraft upgraded, no readiness improved, but 412 veterans waited over a year for prosthetic limbs." She paused and let that sit in the air for a moment, and then she asked him a very simple question. Was that the right decision? Graham's face was now visibly flushed, and his voice, when it came, had lost the easy confidence of his opening testimony. He said that hindsight was 20/20 and that members of Congress had to make decisions with the information available at the time, and that no one could have predicted the F-35 program would encounter those specific issues. Crockett listened to him finish and then opened the fourth folder, the one with the yellow tab. She removed a printed transcript and placed it on the table. "This is your interview with Defense News in March 2024, 8 months before that supplemental bill passed." She found the highlighted section and read your own words back to you. Quote, "The F-35 modernization effort is plagued by cost overruns and timeline slippage. We've seen this pattern before, and we need to be smarter about where we put our dollars. Contractors are billing us for redundant work, and Pentagon leadership isn't holding them accountable." End quote. She looked up at him. "Those are your words, Senator. Sworn testimony, on the record, 8 months before you voted to take money from veterans' prosthetics and give it to the exact program you had publicly called plagued by cost overruns." She paused and asked him if he remembered saying that. Graham's hands were trembling slightly now, and he said that his concerns about the program didn't mean the program wasn't essential and that national security required funding even imperfect systems. Crockett said she appreciated that logic and asked him if he had expressed those same concerns to the 412 veterans who were still waiting for their prosthetics in March 2025. Graham said that was a false equivalency and that she was conflating separate budget issues. Crockett said she wasn't conflating anything. She was reading his own voting record and his own public statements and asking him to explain how they fit together, and then she opened the fifth folder. This one was thicker than the others. It was a 3-ring binder with at least 40 plastic-sleeved pages inside, each one marked with a small, sticky note. Crockett said she wanted to show him something that might help clarify the pattern. Over the past 4 years, Senator Graham had voted on 14 separate appropriations bills that involved funding for veterans' medical services, disability benefits, or prosthetic equipment. She had reviewed all 14 votes and cross-referenced them against the programs that received reallocated funding in each case. She turned to the first tabbed page and read the date and bill number aloud. October 2022, Senate Bill 1904. Veterans Disability Claims Processing Enhancement Act. This bill would have funded 200 additional claims processors to reduce the backlog of disability claims that were averaging 14 months to process. The cost was $42 million. The bill failed by 3 votes. Graham voted no. The funding instead went to a pilot program for autonomous drone surveillance systems that was discontinued 6 months later after the contractor failed to meet performance benchmarks. She turned to the next tab. April 2023, Senate Bill 2156, Veterans Mental Health Crisis Intervention Expansion. This bill would have funded 86 additional crisis counselors and extended hotline hours to 24/7 coverage in 12 underserved regions. The cost was $31 million. The bill failed by 2 votes. Graham voted no. The funding instead went to an aircraft carrier maintenance contract extension that Pentagon auditors later found included $18 million in unjustified labor charges. She turned to the next tab. September 2023, Senate Bill 2601, Homeless Veterans Housing Initiative. This bill would have funded transitional housing for 900 veterans experiencing homelessness in 5 southern states, including South Carolina. The cost was $54 million. The bill failed by 4 votes. Graham voted no. The funding instead went to a missile defense upgrade program that was delayed by 2 years due to technical failures and ultimately cost $107 million more than the original contract specified. Crockett went through 6 more examples with the same methodical precision, each one following the same pattern. A veterans program that needed funding, a bill that failed by a narrow margin. Graham's no vote. Money reallocated to a defense contract that either failed, was discontinued, or vastly exceeded its budget. By the time she reached the 12th example, the room was completely silent except for her voice and the sound of her turning pages in the binder. Graham had stopped attempting to interject. His aides were no longer passing him briefing papers. The press gallery had stopped typing because they were listening to every word, and some of them were now looking at Graham with expressions that had moved past professional neutrality into something closer to incredulity. Crockett finished the last example and closed the binder. She placed both hands flat on the table and looked directly at Graham and said she had one more thing to show him. She reached under the table and lifted a small cardboard box onto the surface in front of her. Inside the box were 14 file folders, each one labeled with a name, a date, and a location. These are letters, Senator, 47 of them, written by military families from 12 states including your own. They were sent to your office between January 2024 and February 2026. Every single one of them describes a veteran waiting for medical equipment or disability benefits or mental health services that were delayed or denied due to budget shortfalls. She opened the first folder and removed a handwritten letter on lined notebook paper. This one is from Patricia Holloway of Greenville, South Carolina. Her husband served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic. He came home with traumatic brain injury and PTSD. In November 2024, he was approved for in-home mental health services, but the program was defunded mid-year due to budget reallocations. He died by suicide in January 2025 while waiting for those services to resume. Mrs. Holloway sent this letter to your office on February 3, 2025. She never received a response. The room was so quiet now that the ventilation system could be heard cycling air through the overhead ducts. Crockett removed a second letter. This one is from Marcus and Jennifer Chen of Charleston. Their son was a Marine Corps sergeant who lost both legs in a training accident in 2023. He was fitted for prosthetic limbs in April 2024 and told the equipment would arrive within 8 weeks. It arrived in March 2025, 11 months later, because of the exact budget reallocation we discussed earlier. During those 11 months, he couldn't work, couldn't attend physical therapy, couldn't live independently. He moved back into his parents' home at age 29 and spent nearly a year waiting for the equipment that would let him walk again. The Chens sent this letter to your office on April 12, 2025. They received a form response thanking them for their input on veterans' issues. She placed the letter down and removed a third. This one is from Reverend Thomas McKinney of Columbia, South Carolina. He runs a transitional housing program for homeless veterans. In September 2023, his program applied for federal funding under the Homeless Veterans Housing Initiative, the same bill you voted against. Without that funding, his program had to turn away 43 veterans in 2024 alone because they didn't have the bed space or the staff to serve them. Reverend McKinney sent this letter to your office on June 8, 2024. He sent a follow-up letter in December. He sent a third letter in March 2025. He never received a response to any of them. Crockett looked up at Graham and said she had 44 more letters like these in this box, all from families in his own state, all describing veterans who were waiting for services that were delayed or denied because of budget decisions he had voted for. She asked him if he had read any of them. Graham's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. He said his office received thousands of letters and that he couldn't personally respond to every one. Crockett nodded and said she understood that completely. Then she asked him a very simple question. If you can't read letters from the families of veterans who died waiting for the services you voted to defund, Senator, how can you stand here and tell this committee that you prioritize military readiness? 23 seconds of absolute silence. Not a camera shutter, not a pen on paper, not a breath audible anywhere in the gallery. Graham's face had gone from flushed to pale, and his hands were no longer gripping the table but were instead clasped in front of him as though he were trying to hold something together that was coming apart. His mouth opened twice, but no sound came out. On the third attempt, he managed to say that he had always supported the troops and that his voting record reflected a commitment to national defense that spanned 3 decades. His voice cracked on the word decades. Crockett said she didn't doubt his commitment to defense contractors, but she had a hard time finding evidence of his commitment to the people who actually served. She turned to a final document, a single sheet of paper that she placed on the table in front of her with the reverence of someone handling a death certificate. This is the transcript of your floor speech from September 2023 when you spoke against the Homeless Veterans Housing Initiative. She read aloud, quote, "We cannot continue to throw money at social programs that don't address the root causes of homelessness. Our veterans need jobs and purpose, not government handouts." End quote. She looked up. 43 veterans were turned away from Reverend McKinney's program in 2024 because you voted against funding it. 3 of them died on the streets before the year ended. One of them was a decorated Navy SEAL who served 4 combat deployments. She paused. What root cause did he need to address, Senator? What job was he supposed to get while he was sleeping in his car? Graham stood abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor with a sound that made half the gallery flinch. He said this hearing had become a partisan circus and that he wouldn't sit here and be accused of not caring about veterans by someone who had never worn the uniform. His voice was loud now, but it wasn't confident. It was defensive, nearly desperate, the sound of a man who knows he's losing and can't find the exit. Crockett remained seated, her posture unchanged, her voice still quiet and measured. She said she had never claimed to have worn the uniform, and she had immense respect for those who had. But wearing the uniform 30 years ago doesn't give you the right to ignore the people still wearing it today, and it certainly doesn't give you the right to defund their medical care so you can send money to contractors who bill the Pentagon for work they never finish. Graham pointed at her and said she was twisting his record and taking votes out of context, and that anyone who looked at the full picture would see he had fought for military funding his entire career. Crockett said she wasn't twisting anything. She was reading his votes and his public statements and asking him to explain them, and so far the only explanation he'd offered was that defense contractors were more important than the veterans they were supposed to serve. Graham's face was now a deep red and his hand was shaking as he pointed. He said he didn't have to stand here and listen to this and that he had answered every question she asked. Crockett said very quietly that he actually hadn't answered a single one. He had deflected, denied, and accused her of partisanship, but he had not explained why 412 veterans waited over a year for prosthetics, while $311 million went to a failed program he had publicly criticized. He had not explained why he voted against mental health funding for a veteran who later died waiting for services, and he had not explained why 43 homeless veterans were turned away from a program he defunded while claiming they needed jobs instead of handouts. Graham yanked the microphone off his jacket so hard the clip snapped. He said he was done with this hearing and that his lawyers would be reviewing the transcript for defamatory statements. He turned and walked toward the door with both aides scrambling to gather papers and follow him. Crockett watched him go and then turned back to the committee chair and said she had no further questions for this witness. The door closed behind Graham with a heavy metallic sound that echoed in the now silent chamber. Crockett began gathering her folders and placing them back into a canvas tote bag with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout the hearing. A reporter in the press gallery stood and asked if she had a comment on the senator's departure. Crockett looked up and said she thought the senator's departure spoke for itself. She said she had come to this hearing with 47 letters from military families, 14 voting records, 6 Pentagon Inspector General reports, and one simple expectation: that a man who had spent 30 years claiming to fight for the military would be able to explain why his votes consistently prioritized defense contractors over the people who wore the uniform. She said she was disappointed that he chose to leave rather than answer those questions, but she wasn't surprised. Men who build careers on rhetoric rather than results rarely have good answers when someone brings the receipts. She placed the last folder in her bag and stood. The cardboard box with the letters remained on the table. She looked at it for a moment and then looked at the camera and said these letters would be entered into the congressional record in full so that the families who wrote them would know their voices had been heard even if their senator had chosen not to listen. She said Patricia Holloway deserved an answer about why her husband died waiting for mental health services. Marcus and Jennifer Chen deserved an answer about why their son spent 11 months unable to walk. Reverend McKinney deserved an answer about why 43 veterans were turned away from his program, and every single veteran who had been told to wait, to make do, to understand that budget constraints required difficult choices deserved to know that those difficult choices had sent billions of dollars to contractors who failed to deliver, while the people who had actually served were told there wasn't enough money to go around. She picked up the box of letters and held it against her chest the way someone might hold something precious and irreplaceable. She said this wasn't about partisan politics or social media talking points or freshman representatives who didn't understand how appropriations work. This was about whether the United States Congress would prioritize the people who risk their lives to defend this country, or the corporations who profit from those risks without bearing any of the cost. She said she knew which side she was on, and now the American people knew which side Senator Graham was on too. She turned and walked toward the exit, and the cameras followed her all the way out of the room while the box of letters remained visible in her arms and the empty chair where Lindsey Graham had sat 30 minutes earlier stayed empty under the lights. 4 hours later, Graham's office released a statement calling the hearing a politically motivated attack and claiming his voting record demonstrated decades of unwavering support for America's military. The statement did not mention Patricia Holloway or the Chen family or Reverend McKinney or any of the 47 letters. It did not address the Pentagon Inspector General reports or the $311 million in failed F-35 contracts or the 412 veterans who waited over a year for prosthetics. By evening, the video of Graham walking out had been viewed 18 million times across 5 platforms. By the next morning, it was 37 million. The clip of the 23-second silence had been edited into a standalone video and shared another 12 million times with captions in 8 languages. News outlets ran the hearing footage under headlines that ranged from neutral summaries to devastating takedowns, but every single one of them included the image of Crockett holding the box of letters and Graham's empty chair. In Greenville, Patricia Holloway watched the hearing on her laptop and cried for the first time since her husband's funeral. In Charleston, Marcus Chen called his parents and told them someone had finally said what needed to be said. In Columbia, Reverend McKinney printed the transcript and posted it on the bulletin board at his shelter next to the photos of the 3 veterans who had died on the streets in 2024. 2 weeks later, Lindsey Graham announced he would not be seeking re-election in 2028. The statement cited a desire to spend more time with family and pursue opportunities in the private sector. It did not mention Jasmine Crockett or the hearing or the letters, but everyone who read it knew exactly what had happened. You don't recover from being destroyed on camera with your own words and your own voting record and 47 letters you never answered. You don't come back from walking out of a hearing because you couldn't explain why defense contractors mattered more than the veterans you claimed to serve. And you certainly don't survive the image of a first-term representative from Texas holding a box of letters from families you ignored while your empty chair sits under the lights and the cameras and the judgment of 50 million people who watched you run. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She went back to her office and kept working. But 3 months later, when a reporter asked her about the hearing, she allowed herself a small smile and said she had learned something important that day. She had learned that preparation beats arrogance every single time, and that men who spend decades dismissing women based on their credentials usually do it because they know those women did the homework they never bothered to do. She said Senator Graham had questioned her qualifications at the start of that hearing, But she wasn't the one who walked out unable to answer a simple question about why veterans died waiting for services while contractors got paid for work they never finished. That distinction, she said, would follow him for the rest of his life, and it did.